Some time ago, I covered the life of Millicent Fawcett, the leader of the suffragist movement trying to gain the vote for women. Today, we will return to her family to tell the life of her older sister Elizabeth, who would also be a trailblazer for women, mostly in the world of medicine, but also politically as she grew older. Elizabeth Garrett was born on the 9th of June 1836 in Whitechapel, London. Although not born in the region, she already had connections with the county of Suffolk. Her father was originally from Leiston, born into a long-established family of ironmongers, who owned Richard Garrett and Sons, who'd been making agricultural machinery, steam engines and trolleybuses since 1778. This life never particularly appealed to him, and once his education was over, something he never took to very well anyway, he left the town and the county, heading south for London to make his way in the world. In his new home, he met Louisa Dunnell, the daughter of a local innkeeper, who, coincidentally, had also moved to the capital from Suffolk some years before. The pair soon married and set up a pawnbroker's shop at number 1 Commercial Road in Whitechapel. The young Garrett family grew fast, and Newson and Louisa soon had 3 children: Louis, Elizabeth, who will be following today, and Dunnell. Sadly, mortality was high at the time, and within 6 months, Dunnell had died. The family remained in Whitechapel until Elizabeth was 3 years old, when they moved to 142 Longacre in Westminster. Her father's business was growing and he needed a larger shop. The London life was not to last forever, though, and in 1841, Newson moved his family back to Suffolk, where he used the money he had earned from his pawn shop and later a silversmith business he ran to buy land by the River Ald and build Snape maltings, where cereal grain would be converted into malt, to be used in brewing beer and making whisky. The family settled in nearby Aldborough, in Ald House which they had built for them, and in the following years more children were born, including Millicent. Like all of the Garrett children, Elizabeth was raised to be very independent and open-minded. A popular image of Victorian entrepreneurs and business owners, such as Newson and Louisa, is them locking their children, especially daughters, away in their home, but not the Garretts. Elizabeth was free to explore the local area as she saw fit, often wandering the salt marshes or going down to watch the boat builders at work. She was also encouraged from a young age to pay attention to what was going on in the political world, both locally and nationally, something that was close to unheard of for a young woman at the time. Elizabeth's first taste of education came from her mother, as there was no school in Aldborough at the time, and it would be from her she would learn the basics of reading, writing and maths, until the age of 10, when a governess was hired to teach her further. This would mark the beginning of a rather fraught relationship with education. Elizabeth was an incredibly quick-witted and fast-thinking child, who soon came to hate the rather dull and rigid world that this governess, Miss Edgeworth, brought with her. Mornings were spent learning in the makeshift classroom set up in the house. Afternoons brought educational walks around the village and area. Mealtimes didn't even bring an end to this, as Miss Edgeworth was sat at the table with the family, quizzing and teaching Elizabeth and her siblings while they tried to eat. Not even the setting of the sun offered a full escape. At night, the governess slept in a curtained-off area in the girls' bedroom. This went on for 3 years until Elizabeth was sent to a boarding school for ladies in Blackheath, London, where she was further educated in English literature, French, Italian and German, as well as general etiquette and behaviour lessons, to make her a Victorian lady. Once again, Elizabeth hated it, decrying the stupidity of those who taught her and the lack of things that truly inspired her, such as science and mathematics. Instead, her days were filled with Tennyson, Wordsworth and Milton. She would be educated in Blackheath until 1851, and when she graduated from the school, she was described as having a superior mind, someone who kept her cool in an argument, was calm but firm when dealing with others, but didn't suffer fools easily. Other than a short holiday around Europe, the next 9 years of her life was taken up mostly working domestically, although she always found free time for her reading, studying Latin and keeping an eye on the political goings-on, with meetings between her and her sisters and friends, often turning into deep political discussions. The seed that would grow into her future career was planted around the age of 18, when along with 2 friends she had met at school while in Blackheath, Jane and Anne Crowe, she was invited to Langham Place, where she met Emily Davies, the pioneering campaigner for women's rights to university access. The pair soon struck up a fast and lifelong friendship. Emily was always more than happy to lend an ear or give advice to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth soon became a fixture among that group of early feminist women known as the Langham Place Circle. It's unclear exactly what made Elizabeth decide upon entering the medical field, but one possibility is that she might have read one of the early editions of the English Women's Journal that dealt primarily with female employment and equality. And given her circle of friends, this is a real possibility. Among the articles found in those journals was one on Elizabeth Blackwell, the English-born joint British and American national, who became the first female doctor in the United States in 1849. Dr. Blackwell herself came to London in 1859, giving lectures on medicine as a profession for ladies. Elizabeth rushed to attend them, even joining the Society of Promoting the Employment for Women, who were hosting her in the capital. She was even allowed a one-on-one meeting with the doctor, and it seems from this Elizabeth had made up her mind. She too was going to be a doctor. When Elizabeth first told her parents her plans, not only to enter the medical field but to become a doctor, they were horrified. Despite instilling an open-minded attitude in their children, this was a step too far into the radical for them. They had ultimately hoped their daughter would marry young and marry well, hopefully into Victorian society, but this was clearly not to be. Her father Newstom's initial reaction seemed to have mellowed fast, though, and he would financially support her while she worked towards it, even coming with her when she went to visit doctors in Harley Street. Elizabeth set out to take the medical world by storm, but initially soon found little more than doors shutting in her face. So she stepped back to rethink her idea. Going straight in to be a doctor was never going to work for a woman at the time, so she decided she would have to prove herself and work her way up. In August 1860, she started to study to be a surgical nurse in the Middlesex Hospital. She would be there for around 6 months, working hard and proving herself a confident and capable nursing student. And it wasn't long until she was attending outpatient clinics and helping in surgeries. When not helping in the hospital, she devoted much of her free time to her studies. She studied Latin, Greek, and medical textbooks regularly, with help from the hospital's apothecary. She even employed a private tutor to teach her anatomy and physiology 3 nights a week. All of her extra work impressed her instructors, and they were soon allowing her into the hospital's medical school to attend chemistry lectures and work in the dissecting room. But it would not all be good news. Many knew of Elizabeth's plan to try and become a doctor, and many did not like the idea at all. First, she was denied direct enrolment into the medical school. Then, to make matters worse, the male students who had long resented her trying to advance herself now plotted against her. And in early 1861, they presented the administration of Middlesex with an ultimatum to get rid of her. They agreed, and Elizabeth was forced to leave the hospital altogether, although she did with honour certificates in chemistry and materia medica. Thrown out of Middlesex, Elizabeth's dream must have seemed more like a fading fantasy. She tried to enrol in pretty much every medical school you could name, only once again to find door after door closing on her. Oxford, Cambridge, Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews, and the Royal College of Surgeons. At a loss of what to do now, she soon began to look for a way of getting what she wanted, and she was determined to see this through. Around the same time, she met a woman in a near identical situation to her, Sophia Louisa Jex Blake from Hastings, also desperate to become a doctor. They both put their heads together and discovered a solution. In her research, Elizabeth found a loophole in the form of the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, who, unlike all other institutions at the time, did not specify that women were banned in the charter when they were founded, although this did not stop them from trying to stop her enrolment, but swift intervention from her father, threatening to involve some very important lawyers if they violated their own charter, soon made them change their position. After getting her certificates in anatomy and physiology privately through her tutor, she would enrol in the society in 1862, the lone woman there, and in her class alone she was learning alongside 51 men. And with Elizabeth now in the society, Sophia, a few years still behind her, began to look for her own private lessons to earn the certificates needed to enter the society as well. She would study at the society for 3 years, along with keeping up her private lessons with several tutors now, including ones who had taught at schools that had rejected her. She took part in her final exams in 1865. By then, of the 51 who had started, only 7 were ready to take the exam, and of those, only 3 passed, Elizabeth achieving the highest marks of the 3. And with this, she obtained a license from the Society of Apothecaries. And although it was not a straight medical diploma, it did entitle her to practice medicine, making her the first woman in Britain to obtain a diploma to practice medicine. And she became the second woman added to the British Medical Register. Elizabeth Blackwell had been the first. But for those who wished to follow her, things were not going to be so easy. No sooner had the ink dried on Elizabeth's license, the Society of Apothecaries changed their rules, preventing any woman from obtaining a license through them, and also banned women from sitting their exams after studying privately, temporarily ending the dream of Sophia Louisa Jex Blake. These rules would stand until 1876, when the Medical Act opened all medical training for women, and after this Sophia would go on to be the first female doctor in Scotland. Keen to put her new qualification to work, Elizabeth applied to a number of hospitals. But despite graduating top of her class, as a woman, no hospital would take her as a doctor. You may have noticed by now that Elizabeth was not a woman who gave up in the face of adversity. So, if no one was going to employ her, she would employ herself. With initial financial help from her family, she opened her own medical practice in 20 Upper Blakeney Street in West London, but struggled to get more than a handful of patients. Many were not sure about being seen by a female doctor. After 6 months of struggling along, she set up an outpatient dispensary, where she offered her services mainly to the poorer women of the city. 1865 would be a rather slow year when it came to Elizabeth's work, but 1866 would turn out to be anything but, as London was rocked by a cholera epidemic. It would be the 4th major epidemic of the 19th century. It had started in the Ganges Delta in 1863, carried by those going on religious pilgrimages, merchants, traders, and other travellers. It soon spread across the world, from Russia to Arabia and Africa. Eventually it would claim 600,000 lives. It reached Britain in 1866 and hit the East End of London hard. At the time, the capital was close to finishing their major sewage system to help clean the city streets and the River Thames. This saved other parts of the city from the worst. But when it came to the yet unfinished East End, the open sewers mixed with the crowded conditions was the perfect breeding ground for the epidemic. By now, Elizabeth had moved her new practice, named St Mary's Distillery for Women and Children, to 69 Seymour Place in Marylebone. And like all medical professionals in the city, her services were now in great demand. Women flocked to her from all over the city. From the richest to the poorest, cholera did not discriminate, and within a year she had 3,000 new patients, and would look after them as the numbers grew and the epidemic dragged on worldwide until 1875. Despite her busy workload, Elizabeth was always looking for ways to further her career, and it clearly did not sit right with her that despite all her hard work, all she was an apothecary, looked down on by many in the medical world, and she was not going to be happy until she had attained a full medical degree. But as the law stood in Britain, this was not going to happen any time soon. When she heard that the University of Sorbonne in Paris was considering allowing women to enter their medical courses to obtain full medical degrees, Elizabeth, now 33, devoted much of her free time to learning French so she could take their tests. In 1866 she became a visiting physician in East London Hospital for Children, making her the first woman in Britain to obtain a medical position. Through this pioneering work and her close ties with the suffrage movement, she was also invited to functions and gatherings being held by Liberal MPs who supported their cause. And it was through this she first met Henry Fawcett, the MP for Brighton. The two became friends, but he wanted to be much more. He was smitten with her and proposed to her. Elizabeth turned him down at the time, as she was more interested in her career in medicine. Henry would later go on to marry her young assistant Millicent. The Education Act of 1870 saw places on school boards open up to women for the first time, and she stood and was elected by landslide onto the East London School Board. Her victory attributed to the years she had spent helping the women and children of that part of the city. That year she also felt she had learnt enough French to make her way to Paris and sit for their medical exam. something she did that June. It was the first medical degree in France achieved by a woman, and officially made her a doctor. She had turned 34 just 6 days before. But when she returned to Britain, she found that the British Medical Register refused to recognise it. Elizabeth would change her mind on the idea of marriage as time went on, and in 1871 she married George Skelton Anderson, a financial advisor for hospitals, the co-owner of the Orient Shipping Company that later became P&O, and he also served as her chairman on her school board campaign the year before. She became Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. At the time it was common, even for the most independent of women, to give up any job they may have after being married. But, as you would probably guess, this was not going to be the path Elizabeth would follow. And if anyone was in any doubt of this, she had the vow of obedience removed from their wedding ceremony. George was happy to support her in her efforts and career, something he would do throughout their entire life together. Although the couple did have arguments early in their marriage, when George tried to convince her to give him control of her income. She would carry on with her full-time job and her other responsibilities, holding all three positions at the same time until 1873, when she was forced to step back from the school board and visiting physician post due to the birth of her daughter Louisa. As she tried to live her life by the simple mantra, a doctor leads two lives, the professional and the private, and the boundaries between the two are never traversed. That same year she was also granted membership of the British Medical Association, and her position as doctor finally recognised. It would be 19 years until they allowed another woman to join. She would keep up the running of her own practice, now called the New Hospital for Women, as they moved again, this time to Marylebone Road in 1874, where the landmark hotel now stands. She continued to treat women from all over the city, and was keen to hire as many women as possible, among them Frances Elizabeth Hogan from Brecon in Wales, who obtained her doctorate from the University of Zurich in March 1870, the first woman to obtain a doctorate in medicine from any university in Europe. She also found a place for the woman who'd inspired her, Elizabeth Blackwell, who she appointed Professor for Gynecology. 1874 also marks her first major foray into the public world of women's rights. At the time, the physician Henry Munsley published an article on sex and mind in education, where he claimed too much education was bad when it came to women, and would lead to reduced reproductive capacity, make women overexerted, make them more nervous, and even lead to mental disorders. Elizabeth publicly dismissed this idea, arguing that boredom and being kept in home all day were far bigger dangers to women than education. That year she also joined forces again with her old friend, Sophia Louisa Jex Blake, now also practicing medicine herself, and the pair founded the School for Medicine for Women, the only hospital in Britain to offer medical courses for women. Unfortunately, this would also mark a falling out between her and Sophia, when it came time to decide who was going to run the hospital. Sophia naturally assumed she would be a shoo-in, but Elizabeth disagreed due to her temper and her rather short fuse. Isabel Jane Thorne was chosen instead. This was not something that Sophia would forget, and when Elizabeth stood in the election to be the school's dean in 1883, Sophia was the only member of the council to vote against her. Despite this unpleasantness, Dr. Anderson would hold that position of dean until 1902, and throughout the years she was there, she helped with the running of the school and regularly lectured there as well. The facilities they set up still exist to this day, now serving as part of the medical school for the University College London. 1874 would also bring the birth of a second child, another daughter, Margaret. But it would be a short-lived happiness. Despite her medical training and knowledge, Elizabeth, like so many mothers at the time, was forced to watch powerless when young Margaret developed meningitis and passed away around 1 year old. The loss of Margaret must have left an impression on Elizabeth and George, as it would be 3 years until their next child, a son called Alan. There was a major victory for women in medicine in 1876, when the previously mentioned Medical Act passed, allowing women the same access to training and courses as men. If Elizabeth thought the hard work of her, Sophia, and Frances were changing minds in the world of medicine when it came to a woman's place, they would have been in for a surprise when, in 1878, the British Medical Association set forward the motion to have women removed from their ranks, after much debate between its members, with many, such as Dr. Norman Kerr, horrified at the idea of women being thrown out, as far as he saw it, all members should be treated equally. Elizabeth was allowed to keep her place, but no other woman would be allowed on until 1892. As time went on, Elizabeth's reach extended across London, and soon she was looking to start a new women's hospital. Euston Road in central London was selected, and the architect J. M. Boyne was employed. He was to be aided by Elizabeth's younger sister Agnes and her cousin Rhoda Garrett. Both worked as interior designers. The hospital would go on to have over 300 students and be totally female operated, a tradition that would carry on until the 1980s. 1897, Elizabeth was elected as the president for the East Anglian branch of the British Medical Association, that had by now become far more friendly to women. When not working, teaching, marking work, or looking after her family, Elizabeth also found time to write several medical papers as well. In 1900, her portrait was painted by John Singer Sargent and can now be found in the National Portrait Gallery. Elizabeth would largely retire from the medical world in 1902, although each year she did travel back to the school in London she had founded to welcome the new students and give an inaugural speech. She and George moved from London back to her childhood home in Aldborough, moving into the old family home in 1903, where she turned her hand to gardening, homemaking, and travelling with friends and family. 1907 would bring a bad year for Elizabeth. Both the death of her mother following a stroke, her father had already passed back in 1893, and then the death of her beloved husband George, aged 79 on the 25th of March. It was possibly the loss of George that made her change her mind on retirement, and she soon realised that she needed to do more with her later life than trim the rose bushes. On the 9th of November 1908 she stood as Mayor of Aldborough, a position her father and husband had also held in the past. A successful campaign saw her elected unanimously by the council, also adding another first to her list of life achievements, the first female mayor in England, at the age of 72. She was even sent a telegram by King Edward VII congratulating her on the achievement. It said he took note of the occurrence, as the 9th of November was also his birthday. It would be impossible to talk about women in politics in the late 19th and early 20th century and not come into contact with the suffrage movement in some way, and this is certainly the case when it came to Elizabeth. Of course, she didn't command as much of the spotlight as her younger sister Millicent, but she had been on the peripherals of the movement for some time. As her daughter later explained, the way Elizabeth saw it was, it would be unwise to be identified with a second unpopular cause. Nevertheless, she gave her whole-hearted adherence. She'd been a member of the women's discussion group, the Kensington Society, in her younger years, along with her sister and Emily Davies. In 1866, she had signed a petition along with 1,500 others, asking for women who were the heads of their household to be given the vote. It would be rejected. She'd become a member of the National Society for Women's Suffrage, even serving on the committee for a short time in 1889. But it would be later in life that she would be much more involved, even giving speeches as Aldborough's mayor on the subject. Of course, the position also came with much day-to-day running of the town, and by the time her term was over, she had made good the time she had spent in the position. She'd had the old, mostly derelict pier demolished. The water tower was enlarged to keep up with the growing population. New public toilets had been built, trees planted, dustbin collection had become a regular occurrence once again, and on the cold, dark winter night of February 1909, she personally led a group around the town, choosing where the new electric streetlights were to be placed. On the 6th of May 1910, Elizabeth received word that as mayor she was about to do something that no other woman had done in English history: officially announce the death of the king and proclaim a new monarch. She awoke the deputy mayor and began to write out her speech, while gathering the rest of the town's officials. Later that day she proclaimed from the church hill, and despite her advancing age she spoke loudly and clearly, that all 400 people gathered in attendance could hear every word. But her entrance into the women's cause would see her stuck between two family members, who had very different ideas on how the vote would be gained. On one hand was her sister Millicent, the devout suffragist, who thought hard work and debate would win the day in the end. On the other hand, her now adult daughter Louisa, also working in the medical field, who, like many of the younger women in the movement, had had enough of this way of thinking, and now saw direct action as the only option. Through the prompting of her daughter, now aged 72, she joined the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, going on lecture tours, joining in some of their demonstrations, even at one time coming close to being arrested along with other suffragettes when she stormed the Houses of Commons in 1909. Although her ongoing suffrage work did affect her life as mayor, when she was re-elected for her second term, it was no longer unanimous. Of the 14 local councillors, 5 had voted against her. In fact, during a meeting shortly after this, one of her opponents interrupted her, scolding her for her friendship with the Pankhursts. She ignored him and looked to the rest of the room, simply saying, "Gentlemen, our first business is the election of an alderman." But outside of her office in Suffolk, more than words were going to be needed, and some situations were never going to be calmed down. This would lead to both mother and daughter being caught up in one of the defining moments of the suffrage movement in Britain, Black Friday. It was the 18th of November 1910, and some 300 suffragettes had gathered to march on Parliament. During the election earlier that year, the now Prime Minister, Herbert Henry Asquith, had promised to support a bill allowing women to vote if he won the next election. He had, and the bill had passed through the first and second readings in Parliament. But now, as the year came to an end, the House of Lords and the House of Commons had fallen out over the yearly budget, and seeing no way to fix the situation, Asquith had called for a new general election and for Parliament to be dissolved by the end of November. The suffragettes and their supporters realised the bill would simply vanish into thin air, never to be seen again. They felt betrayed and planned to demonstrate. Although the suffragettes are known for their direct action tactics, at the time of this demonstration a halt had been called to these actions a few months before, as they believed the government was on their side and working with them. At noon on the 18th, the suffragettes set off from Claxton Hall in Westminster, heading towards the Houses of Parliament, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Dr. Louisa Garrett Anderson, Hertha Arton, and Princess Sophia Duplik Singh. This delegation was in fact allowed in at one point, but soon was told the Prime Minister would not meet with them, and they were forced to leave, being sent back out to join the crowd. All the time the police had been gathering. Normally, these suffragette rallies were dealt with by members of the police called A Division, who knew how to deal with them, and it does seem there was some strange level of respect held for each other between the two groups, with Sylvia Pankhurst later saying, "During our conflict with the A Division, they have gradually come to know us, and to understand our aims and objects, and for this reason, while obeying their orders, they came to treat the women, as far as possible, with courtesy and consideration." Unfortunately, due to the size of the march and how well publicised it had been, police had been called in from across the city, including a large number of officers from the East End, more used to dealing with brawls and the worst the city had to offer than a political demonstration. They descended on the crowd, beating women indiscriminately, often assisted by anti-suffragette supporters. We saw the women go out and return exhausted, with black eyes, bleeding noses, bruises, sprains, and dislocations. The cry went around, "Be careful, they are dragging women down the side streets." We always knew this meant greater ill usage. Even the disabled campaigner, Rosaea May Billinghurst, was beaten and her wheelchair badly damaged. The chaos went on for 6 hours, that saw dozens of women beaten, manhandled and assaulted, some of it sexually, by police and others. 115 women were arrested, as well as 4 men. Among the 115 was Louisa. All charges against everyone was dropped the next day. At least 2 deaths of suffragettes, Henria Leach Williams and Mary Jane Clark, the younger sister of Emmeline Pankhurst, in the following weeks, were attributed to the events of that day. The event was covered in most of the papers at the time, many siding with the police. But the image being carried on many of them, seen on the screen now, didn't sit well with many members of the public, and certainly not with the suffragettes. After this, they became more militant, returning to their window smashing, arson, and eventually their bombing campaign. And this would be the beginning of Elizabeth stepping away from the political movement. Elizabeth found it increasingly hard to support the WSPU, leaving them in 1911 in protest to their arson campaign. Although she did return briefly the following year when Louisa was arrested again, this time being sent to Holloway Prison. Elizabeth stepped back almost fully from public life in 1913. She is described in the final years of her life by Evelyn Sharp during a holiday in Scotland. Old Mrs. Garrett Anderson, only old in years, for there was never a younger woman in heart and mind and outlook than she was when I knew her before the war, was a fascinating combination of autocrat and gracious woman of the world. It seems fitting that what might have been her final ever outing was to return to London to welcome new students to her school in October 1917. Elizabeth died on the 17th of December 1917, aged 81, in Aldborough. Her death was reported the same day in the Evening Star, now the East Anglian Daily Times. The death is announced of Mrs. Garrett Anderson of Aldborough, which took place this morning. Mrs. Anderson was one of the pioneers of lady students of medicine, which she began to study so long ago as 1860. She had opportunities for study at Middlesex and London hospitals, and also St Andrews University. The College of Surgeons and Physicians refused to admit her for their examinations, but she was admitted to the examination at the Society of Apothecaries and obtained a license to practice in 1865. Finally, in 1870, she passed the medical examination of the University of Paris and received her MD degree in 1870. From 1866 to 1890, she was the senior physician in the new Hospital for Women. Mrs. Garrett Anderson was the Dean for the London School of Medicine for Women for 20 years and lectured at that same school for 18 years. Some 20 years ago, she was elected as president of the East Anglian branch of the British Medical Association. Many papers were contributed by her to medical journals. For many years, she practiced in London, where she also took a foremost part in educational work, having been a member of the first London School Board. In 1908, she became the Mayor of Aldborough, thus being the first Lady Mayor in England. Mrs. Garrett Anderson was a widow of Mr. J. Anderson of the Orient Line, one of the pioneers of the uphill struggle. But over the coming days, the paper would go into further detail about her life, describing her as a Suffolk lady of undeniable fame, the pioneer in the practice of medicine for women, and the first of the sex to fill the mayoral chair. They also went into detail much of her struggle and fight to be recognised as a doctor, and as I've already covered this, I won't repeat it again here. Elizabeth was laid to rest in St Peter and St Paul's Church in Aldborough. Just 2 months after her death, the Representation of the People's Act was passed, giving the right to vote to women over the age of 30. It was the first step on the road to universal suffrage. There have been many tributes to her life over the years, mostly in the medical world. The first came in 1918, when the new hospital for women that she had helped found was renamed the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital. And although the hospital is now long gone, the building now making up part of the headquarters for the public service trade union Unison, she has not totally been forgotten there. And there is the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Gallery there, telling her life and honouring her memory. And the hospital's teachings itself now survive its modern incarnation as part of the University College Hospital. Ipswich Hospital has the Garrett Anderson Centre. There is the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson School, a secondary school for girls in Islington in London. The archives of her life are held in the Women's Library at the London School of Economics. The NHS Leadership Academy offers a master's degree in leadership and management known as the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Programme. Her 180th birthday was commemorated by a Google Doodle in 2016. The new medical school, part of the University of Worcester, is set to accept its first students this year and will be called the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Building. A blue plaque can also be found on the building that was once her house and practice in Upper Blakeney Street in London. Her list of firsts are truly amazing. First woman to qualify in Britain to practice medicine. First woman to qualify as a Doctor of Medicine in France. The founder of the first hospital staffed by women. The first woman in Britain to be elected to a school board. The co-founder of the first medical school for women. The first woman to be a member of the British Medical Association. The first woman dean of a British medical school. The first female president of the East Anglian branch of the British Medical Association. And the first female mayor in England. Elizabeth was a woman who liked to keep her professional and her private life as far apart as possible. So I think it's only right to end by highlighting her biggest triumph in each of these different areas. Privately, both her children who survived, Louisa and Alan, went on to achieve highly in their own fields, medicine and politics, and both their lives will be covered in more detail on another day. As for her influence on medicine, Elizabeth once stood alone, the only female doctor in Britain, and got to watch as slowly but surely those numbers grew. And now, as of the last census in 2021, there are 168,000 registered female doctors in the country, making up 47% of the profession. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first female doctor in Britain, and this was a little bit of history.